He was going to use this meeting with Gromyko to kind of see what his thoughts were on the fact that there were missiles in Cuba, because as I mentioned yesterday, the Cubans don't know that we know there's missiles in Cuba, and the Russians don't know that we know there's missiles in Cuba. So that's where he ended yesterday, is that he was going to meet with Gromyko. Okay? So the two men are going to meet in the Oval Office. They're going to discuss several items. And then all of a sudden, Gromyko says to the president, you know, the United States really should stop threatening Cuba. That's what he said to him, not knowing any of this information. So the two men meet in the Oval Office. They discuss several items. And then diplomat Gromyko suggested to the president that the United States should stop threatening Cuba. Because we've been threatening Cuba since Eisenhower was president. Really, realistically, right? Bay of Pigs. And Gromyko basically made the statement, you know, it'd be better if the United States quit threatening Cuba. Well, Kennedy took that for an opening, and he expressed his concern to Gromyko about the possibility that any Soviet Union actions of putting offensive weapons in Cuba. In other words, he said, well, I get that. I understand that you're concerned about our continued harassment of Cuba, so to speak, or our threatening of Cuba, but you don't think there's any possibility that the Soviet Union, your country, would put any offensive weapons in Cuba, do you? I mean, he's kind of putting him on the spot. And Gromyko stated the Soviet Union would never supply Cuba with offensive weapons. The only thing they would give them would be non-military assistance. So Kennedy's feeling the guy out, okay? He's seeing if he's going to lie to him, or see if he actually knows anything, or maybe doesn't know anything. But Kennedy's pretty sure he does. So he's kind of trying to figure out what he knows. So after, again, Gromyko says that the United States should quit threatening Cuba, Kennedy looks at the open door and he says, well, I'm concerned about the possibility of your country, the Soviet Union, ever putting offensive weapons into Cuba. And Gromyko assured him they would only supply Cuba with non-military assistance. Well, although Kennedy knew Gromyko was not telling him the truth, he kept a straight face. He didn't jump on him right away and say, you liar, you know what I mean? He just kept a straight face, and he emphasized again that, you know, it would be a bad thing if the Soviet Union ever put offensive weapons into Cuba. It would be a profound effect, not only on the United States, but the Western Hemisphere as well. And Kennedy didn't want to react to Gromyko because he did not want Gromyko to know that he knew there were missiles in Cuba. Okay? Well, he again, for a third time, says, now, let's be clear on this. There's no possible way that the Soviet Union could be putting offensive missiles in Cuba. And Gromyko again assured the president by saying the sole objective of the Soviet Union was to, quote, give bread to Cuba in order to prevent hunger in that country. So Kennedy gave him 3 chances to come clean on the missiles. And he didn't come clean any of the 3 times. They simply smiled at each other good-naturedly, said goodbye. Gromyko left the White House. So when Gromyko left the White House, he officially denied in Kennedy's mind that any missiles in Cuba were not there, according to the Soviets. But Kennedy knew that there were missiles coming on those merchant ships. Well, the president was very upset after the meeting. He believed that Gromyko had purposely lied to his face, and so he then met privately with Bobby Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell about the crisis. Okay? So Gromyko was asked 3 specific times by the president if there was any chance the Soviet Union would be putting offensive weapons into Cuba. He denied it 3 times. Kennedy was upset, basically called him a liar, and then met with Bobby and Kenneth O'Donnell. And the reason he met with them is because the president was scheduled to go to Chicago on Friday and Saturday, pre-scheduled. And again, he wanted to cancel. And again, both Bobby Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell said he needed to go on as normal because it was crucial that the news did not get out to the press. Besides, Mayor Richard Daley was expecting the president. Okay? Richard Daley is an interesting guy. This guy was a longtime mayor of Chicago. It's gone down the family, and his relatives are now still the mayor of Chicago. And Daley had a little reputation at the time that maybe he might have some ties a little bit to organized crime and the mob. And if you know the history of the election, Chicago and the mob were very instrumental in getting their organizations to vote for Kennedy in the election of 1960, because they thought that that was a crucial state for him to win the presidency, and his father Joseph was in the back rooms negotiating with these mobster type guys all the time to try to get the Teamsters Union and these mob-oriented labor unions to have their membership vote for the president. So Richard Daley was expecting the president. Richard Daley felt that the president owed him an appearance, because it's pretty cool to be rubbing elbows with the president of the United States. And so Richard Daley was expecting him. Now, it's kind of interesting because O'Donnell kind of got after the president a little bit and said, oh, you'd never cancel on Daley anyway. Meaning, you know, you're afraid of him because, you know, he's got mob connections. So O'Donnell kind of good-naturedly teased the president he would be afraid to cancel on Daley, since the Daley family had given him so much in the election. And the president, you know, said, oh no, I'm not afraid to cancel on Daley. And O'Donnell says, oh yeah, you are. And the bottom line was the president kind of was afraid to cancel on him. So he scheduled his trip and decided that he would go to Chicago. But before he left, he told Bobby, you get XCOM back together and I need a consensus for either this or that. What are the two things we've talked about? Blockade or airstrikes. Okay? And he wants XCOM, that committee, to get together while he's gone, and Bobby's supposed to come up with a consensus by the committee that they either want to go with the blockade scenario or the airstrikes. Why does the president think it's important to excuse himself from that discussion? And why is he saying to Bobby, I want you to make sure that you push for a consensus of either airstrikes or invasion by the time I get back? Why would the president do that? Good. Very good. Example, when David Tomrup came up here to talk to you guys, did I stay in the room? No, I went down to the office because I wanted you guys to be able to speak freely, good, bad, or otherwise, about your experiences in this class without you worried about, oh, he'll take offense to that, or oh, he'll do this. That's why President Kennedy did it. He thought it would be better, they could probably better come up with a consensus without it. So, he wants a consensus. What's the definition of consensus, Ricky? All in agreement. He doesn't want any split, because the split is going to show weakness. Okay? And if you don't have everybody supporting a certain concept, it doesn't work very well. Okay? And you got to make sure that he wanted to make sure they understood that. So anyway, that ends Thursday, October 18th, and takes us to Friday, October 19th. So early in the morning of Friday, October 19th, President Kennedy left aboard Air Force One for Chicago, and he took Kenneth O'Donnell with him. He thought it would be better maybe if Kenneth O'Donnell wasn't there either, because obviously that committee sees those people as all in the same philosophy. So O'Donnell goes with Kennedy to Chicago, leaving Bobby back to have the meeting with XCOM to try to get that consensus. So President Kennedy's going to spend the day with Mayor Daley, and Bobby's going to try to get the job done. So the president was planning on staying longer than just the day, right? Didn't I mention that earlier? We talked about he was going to spend a couple days. Well, as President Kennedy was spending the day with Mayor Daley, Bobby called Kenneth O'Donnell. And he told Kenneth O'Donnell, I think I've got a consensus for a blockade, but it's only going to last a day. It's not going to last until the president gets back. Okay? Because the military in the room were still pushing big time for invasion. But Bobby had a majority, almost all, including some of the military, pushed towards the idea of blockade. But he said, if it goes another day, the military is going to flip-flop and we're not going to get this consensus. Okay? So what does Bobby want Kenny O'Donnell to do? Get Kennedy back that day. He doesn't want him to be there the whole trip. So again, Bobby told O'Donnell that XCOM had come up with a consensus for a blockade, but he believed strongly that agreement would only last for a day because the military was continuing to push for invasion and also for airstrikes, and he thought that if it went another day, they'd flip-flop their philosophy. So Bobby told O'Donnell, get the president back to DC before those guys could change their mind. Well, who did O'Donnell go to make this work that had no idea about the crisis in Cuba? No? Member of his cabinet that kind of speaks for him. What? Pierre Salinger, the press secretary. He knows nothing of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nothing. He hasn't been involved, he hasn't been informed, he doesn't have a clue. So O'Donnell goes to Press Secretary Pierre Salinger, and he tells Salinger that the president has developed a cold and needs to return back to Washington, D.C. immediately. That's what he tells the press secretary. Why does he tell Salinger that? Because Salinger's on the trip and he's the one that's going to announce the president's movements. So O'Donnell goes to Salinger and he tells the president that he had developed a cold and needs to return to D.C. Well, Salinger's been with him the whole time. He hasn't seen any cold that the president has contracted here. And he knows nothing about the crisis in Cuba, and he doesn't know any idea what's going on. And he gets very frustrated when Kenneth O'Donnell tells him that. And he says to O'Donnell, quote, Kenny, do I get any input around here? I mean, he's the press secretary, he should have a little input. And O'Donnell looked at him and smiled and he said, yeah, how bad the cold is, that's up to you. That's how so Salinger's just kind of shaking his head, and he gets in front of the press and he announces that President Kennedy would be canceling the rest of his visit in Chicago, and he would be returning to Washington, D.C. on the advice of his doctor. So he got to make that part. But he had no idea what was going on. Zero idea. Salinger was not in the fix. Okay? That's what happened on Friday, October 19th. So we'll move on to Saturday, October 20th. Now, when Kennedy got back from Chicago, he right away met with ExComm, and they studied the options again. Okay? He had the consensus for the blockade, but he wanted to make sure that he had it for sure. So the committee deliberated some more, actually for hours, and finally came up with a recommendation for a blockade of all ships into Cuba. And I can tell you that the military wasn't thrilled to death with this, okay? Because they're concerned about these missiles becoming operational, rightly so. So they're not really concerned. Kennedy's really concerned about the fact that if they act too quickly, we're in a nuclear war with Russia. So the committee, after hours of deliberations, recommends that blockade of all ships into Cuba. Now, this is when Defense Secretary McNamara stood up and said, hey, we got to make sure we do not call this a blockade. We're going to call it a quarantine, not a blockade. So as soon as the decision was made for a blockade of all ships into Cuba, Defense Secretary McNamara made it really clear that this operation had to be called a quarantine, not a blockade. Why? What's the difference between a blockade and a quarantine?
Blockade, you keep stuff out.
Okay, but think you're close. There you go. Blockade is a military term which is really an act of war. Blockade is military term. Quarantine is not. And he just thought it was important for all the countries around that we're going to need support from once this thing gets kind of etchy. We're going to need support from. He doesn't want those countries to think that we are, like Bobby said, picking on a smaller country. So McNamara makes it really clear that this was to be called a quarantine rather than a blockade, because a blockade would be seen as an act of war, whereas a quarantine would not. Now, here is when McNamara stood up and explained the procedure that would be used for the quarantine once it was put into effect. Who's the only guy that can put it into effect? President Kennedy, which he hasn't done yet. So you need to know these. This is the procedure. This is what's going to happen when they start this blockade or quarantine, because these ships are coming. So here is the first step. Once this quarantine went into action, the United States Navy would be responsible to stop any Soviet ship 800 miles out from the line. So they basically drew a line. outside of Cuba in the ocean, and they were to stop these ships 800 miles before they got to the line. This is the initial plan. Once they stopped that ship 800 miles short of the line, what do you think step 2 would be? Anybody have an idea?
Search it.
Very good. Board the ship and inspect it. We don't want to say search, because that makes it sound like you're being militaristic also. We're going to board the ship and inspect it. And the third process is, if it was determined that any vessel was carrying weapons, they would be ordered by the United States Navy to turn around and go back. So that was the initial procedure that was going to be used, as explained by McNamara during this meeting on Saturday, October 20th, if Kennedy decided to officially put the blockade or quarantine into place. He would have to do that officially as president. And if he did, then the United States Navy would stop any Soviet ship that was 800 miles out from the quarantine line. Then they would board the ship and inspect it, and then if it carried any offensive weapons, they would ask it to turn around. Did they talk about taking the weapons? Did they talk about, having a confrontation? No. Okay? Now, this basically solves half of our problem. What is this? This is why the military wasn't real happy. What half of the problem does it solve? We don't have any more missiles going into Cuba. What problem doesn't it solve? The 40 that are already there. And that's the edge that the military was struggling with, is if those 40 on ground get operational, we're in trouble. So McNamara stated that this quarantine would only stop any missiles from entering Cuba. It would not solve the problem of those that were already there. Now, why would this philosophy even work? Well, I mean, why do they think this blockade would work then? And I'm not talking about the military side, because they don't think it's going to work. But what would be Kennedy's thinking, and his brother's thinking, and McNamara's thinking? Wouldn't they think, well, listen, if they know that we're going to stop these ships 800 miles out, we're hoping they would realize, this is going to cause a problem, this could lead to a nuclear war, and they thought that probably Soviet Union would voluntarily remove those missiles from Cuba. Once they figured out the jig's up, we understand there's missiles there, we're going to stop any more from going in, they just thought that might work that way. The hope was that the quarantine would convince the Soviet Union into voluntarily removing their missiles in Cuba to prevent war with the United States. Makes sense. Military didn't buy it so much, but it did make sense. Now, so to satisfy the military, what does McNamara state to the committee if the Soviets refuse to, if we stop those ships and then they refuse to remove those missiles that are already there, what is our next option? Airstrikes. So he's trying to appease the military by saying, hey, let's give this a try. If they do not remove those missiles after we stop these ships, you still have the option of airstrikes followed by invasion. Well, this is where CIA Director John McCone steps in and says, wait a minute. What's wrong with that scenario? Think about where we're at now and where we're heading. Right now the military wants to go in. Right now, airstrike, invade. They're saying, no, let's blockade. Let's stop the ships in the hopes that they voluntarily take them out. Okay? And if they don't take them out, guess what, military? You can still airstrike and invade. What's McCone's concern? What?
That they'll fire right as soon as we figure out.
Say it real quickly.
That they'll fire them right as soon as they figure out that we know that they're...
Absolutely. And that's probably what you're going to say. The element of surprise is totally gone. They're going to know we're coming. And so CIA Director John McCone voiced his opposition to quarantine. He believed the blockade would eliminate America's what he called first strike capability, the element of surprise. And he was absolutely right. He was absolutely right. Now, he didn't even think that they would deal with Berlin. He's thinking this. Now, listen to this. McCone stated that if the Soviet Union sensed that the United States was going to invade Cuba, they'd skip the Berlin scenario, and they would launch their missiles that were operational with the philosophy of we're going to use them or we're going to lose them. That was McCone's concern. You can't do this quarantine, man. This is not going to work. You lose the element of surprise. These guys might forget the Berlin scenario altogether and launch those missiles, any that are operational, with the philosophy of we're going to use them or lose them. Make sense? So you can see the concern in what's going on here. This is when someone who appeared to be a huge coward had some tremendous guts, but nobody thinks he has guts at the time. So as this discussion gets heated, back and forth between John McCone, it's getting hot in there, who steps up and says, maybe one of us in this room should be a coward, so I guess it'll be me? Who stood up and said that was on XCOM? Think about the group there. Who would stand up and say something like that? What?
Bobby?
No? Oh God, no. Bobby's kicked ass and take names. Huh? Who'd you say? Dean Russ, no, he's the Secretary of State. Who's not? Who?
What about the older guys that came in?
No, see, have to be a good guess. Somebody kind of like him.
The speech.
Adlai Stevenson. Did you say that? Did you? Yeah. Adlai Stevenson, the nicest guy, man, two-time loser on presidential elections, who Kennedy put on that committee for his advice. Here's what he says. Maybe one of us in the room should be a coward, so I guess it will be me. He proposes a third option, to strike a deal with the Soviets. This is what he proposes, a third option, to strike a deal. You know, neither one of these are good. The quarantine's got its faults. Certainly in airstrikes and invasion have its faults. I got a third option. Why don't we strike a deal? And he knew he would be perceived as what? A coward, okay? Here was his proposal. You ever heard of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba? What was that at that time? Recently it's kind of diminished. It was a prison for what? Well, military criminals, okay?